For most athletes, a one Ironman race a year is really all we can manage. B priority races, perhaps 3 or 4 of those a year. If you're training for half Ironman distance, now we're really talking about the shorter distance races. We're talking about Olympic distance races and sprint distance races. You could have 3 or 4 of those in your schedule throughout the year and call them B races. B races means we're not going to peak or taper for them as we will for the A race, which requires about a 2 or 3 week process. Instead, for the B races, we'll rest for 2, 3, or 4 days before that race, just to make sure you've got some rest before you go into it. You don't want to go into, even at this level, you don't want to go into the race tired because you're trying to have a good performance. It's just not going to be your best performance. That's being saved for the A priority race. And you can guess, C priority is the lowest priority race. And these races really are done for a number of reasons. They're done for experience. If you're new to the sport, this is the type of races you really should do a lot of. Athletes who are coming into the sport for the first time really need to go see races, go do races to find out what a transition is all about. To find out how the aid stations work, to find out just how the race is conducted. So every time you go to a race as a novice, you learn a lot, and the learning curve is quite steep. For those who have been with the sport for like 3 years or more, as many of you have been, really you don't need very many C priority races because you know about all these things. You might go to a C priority race in that case to test yourself, to see how your fitness is coming along, to use it as a way to get mentally ready for a B or an A priority race, which is going to be shortly thereafter. So it's kind of like a tune-up race, if you will. And you might do it socially. You might have a group of friends who are all going to do a sprint distance race in another town, and it's just kind of fun to all go together and do this race, and so you go do it that way. But these races, you don't rest before them. You simply treat them as hard workouts. It doesn't mean you don't give it your best shot. You're still going to hopefully race well, as best you can, given the fact that you're going to go into a little bit fatigued perhaps, but it's just a hard workout is all it is. So start off your year by deciding which are your A, B, and C priority races and hold down the number of A priority races. And if you're highly experienced in the sport, you're probably better off holding down the number of C priority races also. You'll do much better racing long distance, half Ironman, if you spend more time training and less time going to races, especially short distance races. All right, now let's take another concept here. I'm going to pull all these pieces together in a little bit for you, but I'm going to take another concept and throw it out at you. This has to do with planning your season. How do you think about the entire year? And there's lots of ways of doing this. This is something called periodization, and this is what I'm showing you on this diagram is only one example of periodization, one way of doing it. This is called classic periodization. This is what I wrote about in the Triathletes Training Bible. And this is, by the way, is the way most athletes in the world train. They use a periodization model for their to regulate how they use their time. There are just a few things we're looking at here on this chart. First is fitness. This is our uppermost in our mind. It's how can we create fitness? And the way you create fitness is you increase stress on the body. The body adapts to that stress and grows more fit. And the way we put stress on the body is by training with volume. In other words, having a frequent number of workouts and also long workouts. That puts stress on the body. And then finally, we can train with higher intensity or lower intensity. Higher intensity puts more stress on the body. So we can manipulate volume and intensity to create fitness. That's really the only things we can do with our training. It's the only options we have. We can manipulate volume and we can manipulate intensity, and because of that manipulation, we can wind up creating more fitness, especially at the time of the year where our races are going to occur. So let me show you how we do that now in terms of this timeline. So the idea here is to think in terms of a timeline. Think in terms of what you're going to do at various times of the year as you progress towards one of these A races. So we go back to the very start of the year, and it's what I call the prep period of the season. It's very early. So if we're talking about an athlete who's going to do a race, it's an A priority race, and let's say that's going to be the end of May or early June, we may be talking here about December. I can't use a calendar. If we all had the races on exactly the same day, if everybody had their A1, the most important A race on January 2nd this year, then we simply just use a calendar and we talk about that. But since we're in this room, everybody's got different ideas about what day their most important race is. So I can't use the calendar anymore as a way of discussing this, so I've got to come up with new words to talk about time. And so I'm simply using words called, in this case, preparation or prep period, which is very early in the season. And I'll come back a little bit and show you what that means in terms of what you do in your training. Second period of the year is the base period. Lasts quite a long period of time. Third period of the year, let me stop before I go to the third period. So what we've done now is in this prep and base period, we've been emphasizing volume of training. So our stress that we're trying to apply to the body in order to create adaptation and therefore fitness is coming from volume. So it's frequency and duration of workouts. The emphasis is not on intensity. It's on volume. In other words, it's how long your workouts are and how frequently they occur. So that's this early period of the season. Then we move to this build period of the year. So we're progressing closer to our race. If this was let's say early June race, we may be talking now in the build period, something like about late April, when this would be beginning, April and May. And we'd have our race in June. So now we're getting closer to the race. And in this period of time, you'll notice what happens to this chart is we begin to cut back on volume. Volume is reduced, and intensity becomes more important. It becomes the focus of our training. So this dotted line represents the intensity. So now we're focusing on the intensity. And by intensity, I don't mean absolute intensity. I don't mean going as hard as you can possibly go. I mean intensity relative to the events you're training for. So if you're going to do an Olympic distance race, and you're going to run in the Olympic distance race, your goal pace, let's say, is going to be 7:30 pace per mile, then what you want to do here is do a lot of training at 7:30 pace when you're running. That means that's the intensity. It's specific to the events you're training for. So we're now increasing intensity of training. And then finally, the next stage is this, what I call the peak period. This is for A races only. And for the peak period, what we're doing is we're going to begin to cut back not only on volume, but also on intensity. What happens when we reduce both volume and intensity? Well, what we're doing is we're decreasing stress. When you decrease stress, what happens is you get rid of fatigue, and we begin to see an improved ability to race because of that. Shedding fatigue improves your ability to race. We call that coming into form. An athlete is coming into form when they're ready to race. So that's what we're doing here in this peak period, is we're starting to cut back on training, more rest. And this period may only last like about 2 weeks. That's all we're going to be in this period, for a very short period of time. Then we come to our race week. So now we're at the week of the race. And now we want to make sure we're doing lots of rest, so these lines decrease even more. It becomes an even steeper decline in intensity over here. So now we're decreasing the amount of training we're doing even more, which means more rest. We're becoming more ready to race. And hopefully by the time we get to the race itself, right there, our A priority race, we're really ready to race at a really high level. We're quite rested. We have built a high level of fitness before we came to that race. And now we've gotten rid of the fatigue, and we can race at a high level also. So we've gone through this process of using stress over time to get ready for an important race. And then finally, we go into a transition period, which is a few days or even a few weeks after the race. This transition period may happen early in the season. Let's say it was a June 1 race that you were doing. It was your first A1 or A priority race. This transition period may last 3, 4, 5 days after that June 1 race, and you're just going to take a break from really serious training. It doesn't mean you have to stop working out. It just means you're really not training anymore. You're just going out and doing whatever you feel like doing with no purpose in mind. You don't have to do anything. You can take time off. Let's take this concept now, because I told you originally that you could probably have 1 or 2 A priority races if you're doing a half Ironman or Ironman distance as your A priorities. So let's take a look at this now. If we were doing 2 races in a year, and see what the schedule looks like. But I'm going to change the graphic a little bit. So now you're really looking at the same thing. I'm just using a different way of projecting the same concept. So you can see here, this is volume. The darker area on the chart represents volume, and these steps represent weeks during the year. So every step is a 1-week step. So you can see we're stepping up the volume each of these weeks, then decreasing the volume, and so forth. So you're getting 3 weeks, in this case, 3 weeks of high volume, of increasing volume, and 1 week of low volume, which means 1 week of rest, essentially. So 3 weeks of increasing stress, 1 week of low stress. Then we go through 3 weeks of increasing stress again, 1 week of low stress again. So we're trying to allow your body to recover from the stress you put on it. If you try to make that chart continue to rise over the entire season, the stress gets greater every week, your body will eventually break down. You cannot keep that going at an endless pace. Training, fitness is not this sort of a shape. What you see happen to athletes when they're training for the season is there's lots of ups and downs with sometimes big downs before they build back up again and then a big down again. So we get lots of this going. It's not just a continuous upswing in stress and therefore fitness. So that was the volume. You can see intensity is happening down here again at a lower rate of increase during the early part of the year. And then in this period right here, we've got a more rapid rate of increase. So there's a prep period, there's a base period. Each of these base periods is about a 4-week period. So you can see there's 12 weeks being devoted to the base period there. Here's a build period. You can see there's about 8 weeks being devoted to this build period of time when we're emphasizing what? Intensity. Peak period, about 2 weeks long, prior to the race week. There's race week. Again, we've brought both the volume and the intensity down. And there's our first A priority race that occurs on this given day in the season. So we've built to this one day in time to be in really good shape. Now, that race is over. It's only June. Our next race is going to be August, we'll say. And now what do? So what becomes the next step? Well, the first thing you do is you go into a transition period. You take a few days to give yourself a break from the mental stress and strain and the physiological stress and strain of preparing for that first race. This is necessary. Type A athletes typically don't want to do this. You typically don't want to take some time off, take a break. But this is really very good for you. I always make my athletes do this, and they're always better off because of it. You're going to lose a little bit of fitness, but that's not a bad thing because you're going to lose a lot of fatigue, and you're also going to lose a lot of the soreness you may have had after especially a longer distance race, and you're just going to be a much better athlete later in the year because of it. So you can afford to take a few days and just give yourself a break. Then we go back into training again. So in this case, the athlete has decided to go back to the build period of the season, which means an emphasis on intensity. You have to ask yourself at this point, do I need to go back and work on intensity, or go back before that to the base period and work more on the volume of training? And that's an individual decision that the athlete has to make. Again, another peak period for this athlete coming to their second A race of the season. Race week, and the second A race of the year. Now it's, let's say, September. The athlete's doing their second most important race of the year, or their second A race of the year. And finally, a transition period again now, which may last a month or more. I like the athletes I coach to take about 4 weeks after their last race of the season, the last big race of the season. Let's just take about 4 weeks where you can really just kind of unwind. I'm not going to coach you for 4 weeks. You can do anything you want for 4 weeks with certain parameters. I set limits. Can't train more than once a day. Your bike workout can't be longer than 2 hours. Your run workout can't be longer than an hour. Your swim can't be longer than 45 minutes. The intensity has to be below your 5 zone. In other words, you can't go anaerobic. Given those parameters, do whatever you want. And so they just go out and they just have fun. Take a day off if you want. Take the spouse and go do something in a long time. You haven't talked to the spouse in months now, so this is your biggest chance to spend time doing things that are family oriented. But it gives you a good break from all the stuff you've been doing up to that time. So that's a 2-peak season. So, now, that was the second concept I wanted to throw at you. I'm going to start pulling all these things together later on if I don't run out of time. One of the things I wanted to chat with you here was what does training itself look like? That may sound like kind of a nebulous thought, but the way I've always seen the world is if I can understand something visually, graphically, I can generally understand it at any level I want to. So if I can draw a picture of something, I can understand it. So what does training look like? If I was going to draw a picture of training, what would training look like? Back in the 70s, when I was a much younger athlete and trying to come to grasp with how I could go about training better, I went back to college to get my master's degree in exercise science, thinking that would be the answer and find all the answers to all my questions about how to be a better athlete in that university down the road. And so I went in there, spent a couple of years working on my degree, and when I came out, I had more questions. They were just better questions than I had before. I learned a lot, but the learning typically makes you understand you don't know as much as you need to know. And so that's where I was at this point. And one of the things I still didn't know when I came out of this whole thing, and you have to understand back in the 70s, sports science was, it's hard to even call it science. It was such a weak field back in those days. Much better today. It's come a long ways in 30 years. But back then, sports science was quite weak. And so I spent time talking with athletes, other coaches who were few and far between for endurance coaches, reading everything I get my hands on. There was no web. I couldn't go do a search on things like this. It was a matter of actually finding people and talking face-to-face with people, usually in races or wherever you'd meet them. And so I would play with ideas on what training must look like after talking to somebody. And somebody would give me the idea, well, maybe training is like simply just a straight line. That's all training really is. It's just a progression down a straight line. Maybe that's training. Or maybe training is a circle. Maybe there's some sort of progression that brings us back to the point we started from every time, and we just keep repeating this loop. Maybe that's what training looks like. Or maybe training has got 3 dimensions to it. It's actually a spiral. And somehow there's something going on which has a 3rd dimension to it. So I'm playing with these ideas and trying to figure it out. And in the 80s, I came across a book called Theory and Methodology of Training by Tudor Bompa, PhD. Tudor Bompa is a sports scientist from Romania who left Romania back in the 70s and moved to Canada, where he still is today as a professor. And he had done a lot of work in the area of periodization back in the 60s. Had become one of the top sports scientists in Romania. And so I read his book. It's called Theory and Methodology of Training. It's a really very deep book, very scientific. It's not the sort of thing you would read for light reading at all. And so in the 2nd chapter, he had a diagram, a picture of what training looked like. And I found it for the first time, and so I'm reading his description, and I realized he's captured in a diagram what training is really all about. It's quite simple. I was amazed I hadn't figured it out and thought about it myself before with all the things that have gone through my head on this topic over the years. And then I finally got to go spend time with Dr. Bompa at a camp out in California back a long time ago, and picked his brain about how these ideas came about, where they come from. And it was kind of like really kind of an interesting experience, because this guy, who's now in his late 70s, had been doing what I was interested in for 20 years before I started thinking about it. And so I got to pick his brain about how he came to these conclusions. So let me show you his diagram. Triathletes always like this diagram because they think it's designed just for them, but it really isn't. This is what Dr. Bompa said training looks like. And I know that looks very simple to you, and so it's kind of like, so what, It's just a triangle, but it really works for every sport, not just triathlon. You could be a golfer, it works for that. If you're a basketball player or rugby, or it doesn't matter what sport it is, all sport can be designed using this concept. Notice it has 3 corners and 3 sides, and that's really the key to this. And that begins to define what things we talk about that Dr. Bompa came up with, and that my books are all based on. I had got Dr. Bompa's permission to use his concepts in my books and expand on them, and explain them in a way that perhaps athletes could understand better than his very deep textbook sort of approach to the subject. So let me take you through this very quickly and show you what training looks like. I probably won't finish all of this, but that's okay, because there's some parts of it that really don't apply very well to triathlon. The first part does, though. At the most basic level, this is what Dr. Bompa says that training is. And this is what I call base training. So now I told you a little while ago that in base training we did certain things. This is what you do in that base time of the year, the base season. So we're doing 3 things: endurance, which you guys all understand quite nicely; force, which you may not quite understand as well; and speed skill, which you probably have no idea what I'm talking about. Let me talk you through these 3 points, show you examples of the workouts. These things are all critical early in the year when you're building your original fitness, early in the season, in the base period. First, let's start with endurance. This is the one you all know. You're all endurance athletes, I assume. Type of workout is a long, moderate effort distance workout. Notice I said moderate effort, not slow, moderate. It's not long, slow distance, it's long, moderate distance. I'll come back to this in a second. So it's your longer workouts. This builds endurance. For the Ironman, long is a different word, it means a different number than if you are a sprint distance triathlete. The word long means something shorter in that case. So long is relative to the event you're training for. It doesn't mean you all have to go out and do 6-hour bike rides. That may be an Ironman thing that's being done, but a sprint distance athlete doesn't have to do a 6-hour ride to improve endurance because the sport doesn't have quite the same demands. The primary benefit of this is heart, lungs, blood, and the aerobic system. It's general systems basically, and it's enzymes that are found in the muscles especially that have to do with how your aerobic system operates. We want to improve this as best we can. The intensity is rather on the low side, moderate to low side. If you're using a scale of 1 to 10 to say, 10 is the hardest, 1 is the easiest, this is like about a 3 or 4 on that scale. How many of you have heart rate monitors? Okay, I can probably talk to that group quite nicely. This is like a 2-zone, if you use a 5-zone system, with 5 being the highest zone, this is like a 2-zone effort we're talking about, so toward the low end, not a 1, but a 2. How many of you have power meters? Any power meters in the room? Okay, shame on the rest of you. Someday you'll have one and you'll realize when you do that the world is not what you thought it was. Training becomes altogether different when you get a power meter. How many of you have a GPS device for running speed and distance device like a Garmin or Polar? Okay, much better. That's good. Glad to see that because those are also necessary to understand something else, which is output. Heart rate tells you input. Pace and power tell you output. At the finish line, have anybody ever been asked who had the highest heart rate and therefore you win today at the finish line? Nobody? Nobody? Okay. They usually want to find out who got there first, is what usually determines the rank of the race. That's usually the way it's done in triathlon. And that's usually based on output. Highest pace, highest power. That determines output. So there's better to measure those things quite honestly. Not that heart rate's not important. If you're using a power meter, for those of you who do have that, it's like 60 to 75% of your functional threshold power, which is going into any detail here. Those people know what I'm talking about. Moderate effort, if you don't have any devices whatsoever, and you don't understand the 1 to 10 scale, moderate effort is what I would say to the athlete. And back when I started training back in the 50s and 60s, that's what we talked about. Easy, moderate, moderately hard, hard, and very hard. That's what we kind of defined the world back in those days. Example of this is something like ride 2 hours in the 2-zone. That would be an example of an endurance workout. Ride 2 hours in the 2-zone. Now, if you're training for Ironman distance race, this may be, say, ride 4 hours in 2-zone. So it really, again, long depends on what your event is. Here's an example of one of those type of workouts. This is a real athlete doing a real workout. This very workout I'm talking about. What you see here is heart rate across the top. That squiggle line you see is his heart rate. The squiggle line across the bottom is his power output. This is a bicycle. And I've drawn the blue line, which just indicates what the average was for these. And what I look to see is how well these two lines stay parallel when the athlete has done this workout. If they stay very nicely parallel like you see right here, then that means that the athlete's aerobic fitness is really quite good. If these two lines begin to separate, that means we don't really have very good aerobic fitness yet. So the athlete, if they're riding, holding a very steady power output, or pace if it's running, a very steady pace output, and heart rate begins to rise at some point out there, that indicates fitness is not where it should be yet. We need to do a much better job of improving that athlete's aerobic conditioning. In fact, in this case, we can measure this using software these days, and there was only a 1%, what I call decoupling, like railroad tracks coming apart. These railroad tracks, in this case, are only coming apart by 1% over the course of about 2 hours. And so consequently, this athlete's in quite good aerobic shape for 2 hours. Nice way of measuring it. On the other hand, here's an athlete who, again, heart rate, power, and decoupling is 11%. And you can see it. It stands out vividly. You can see the decoupling. The railroad tracks are coming apart. This athlete is in very poor aerobic condition, awful aerobic condition. The athlete was trying to hold a steady heart rate and power dropped. Now, if I only knew heart rate, I didn't have a power meter on this athlete, or didn't know GPS like pacing, all I have is heart rate, I would say, well, this athlete looks like they're okay. The line is flat. But as soon as I compare that heart rate to something, I learned, not in good shape. They kept getting going slower and slower and slower, in other words, as at that same heart rate. So aerobic fitness wasn't very good. That's why having a power meter or a pacing device is so good for training. Okay, that was endurance. Let's talk about force. You know endurance, force is a little less probably obvious to you. If you were a power lifter, it would make perfect sense. This is a brief, resisted workout of some sort with very long recoveries. So brief, like intervals, brief, very short intervals with very long recoveries at a high output, a high intensity. The primary benefit is muscle. We're trying to improve the muscle's ability to drive the body through the water, across the land on your bike, or by running. Intensity is rather high. So on a 1 to 10 scale, this is like a 9 intensity now. Before it was a 3 or 4, now it's a 9 on a 10 scale, so quite high. Heart rate is really of no significance here because the time is so short. If you have a power meter, it's a CP6 or higher. If you don't understand any of that, it's just hard. Just go out and go hard. However, we're going to do it for very short periods of time, like less than 1 minute. Very hard for a very short period of time. Could be just a few seconds, but we're going to take a very long recovery. So if you did, let's say 1 minute, we're going to recover for like 3 or 4 minutes. Very short, very hard, long recovery. If you do that, you'll start building muscle. The muscle will become much more capable of delivering force to the pedal, to the water, or to the pavement when you swim, bike, and running. An example would be one example would just be lifting weights. And I have athletes do that like back in the prep period. They'll be lifting weights. They may also be using hills or drag devices. When I used to teach a master's swim program, in the winter months during the base period, I would have the swimmers bring a t-shirt to the pool with them and swim with a t-shirt on because that increased the amount of drag. So they have to work harder to overcome the drag, more muscle to overcome the drag. Or the better swimmers might bring a sweatshirt, which you pull even more water, have to work even harder to overcome the resistance. Some would bring like a carpenter's apron with pockets, where you put nails. And so when you start to swim, those pockets open up and they drag even more water. One guy used to bring a bucket with a rope. He'd put a weight, belt on with a rope and a bucket head to the end of it, swim pulling a bucket. So his bucket's being dragged along behind him. He's got to work really hard to overcome the resistance. It's a great force workout. Here's an example. The lighting is making this difficult to see. I apologize, but the upper part of this is heart rate. Let's go back. Upper part of this is heart rate right here. And all the athlete's doing is short hill climbs. So less than a minute, hard up the hill. You're coming back down easy on the flats, hard up the hill. So this athlete is just using the terrain where he or she lives to work on force. So very simple workout. Let's go to speed skills, which is a critical workout also for most athletes. This is the one that's probably most disregarded by endurance athletes with the exception of swimmers. Swimmers are the only endurance athletes I know that really focus on this a lot. Speed skills. You need to have the ability to make the movements of your sport at the speed at which those body parts will be moving in the race. So by speed, I don't mean how fast your body is moving, like you're running at 6-minute pace or something. What I mean is how fast can your legs turn over while you're running? What's your cadence? You should be able to run with a cadence of about 90 RPM, which means your right foot hits the ground 90 times in a minute. You should be able to do that. Most triathletes can't, I found. Most triathletes run somewhere around 80 to 84 RPM. That's too slow. You need to bring your cadence up. You're not very efficient. You're wasting lots of energy if you run like that. Same on your bike. If you have a very low cadence and you just kind of push the pedals this way as you ride, it's actually kind of a waste of energy when you do that. If you swim, we can get carried away with trying to get a long stroke in the pool to the point that you actually start wasting energy. We need to be somewhere, we need to have a better cadence for that also. Typically it's around 45 to 55 RPM in the pool. So we've got these numbers we work toward, and I like to see my athletes be able to accomplish those numbers. This type of workout is very short repeats emphasizing technique. Primary benefits of the nervous system. We tend not to think about the nervous system as endurance athletes, but it's critical to success. The intensity is very high. We want to eventually be able to do it at the pace or power that we do it at in the race. Whatever our goal pace or power is, we want to be able to run 90 RPMs at the pace we're going to do it in the race. We want to be able to swim 45 to 55 RPM at the pace we're going to swim in the pool or in the open water. So we're trying to get all these things up to that level with good skill. Typically what breaks down when you get up to higher cadences is the form begins to break down, technique begins to break down, and we don't want that to happen. We want to maintain very good technique because it doesn't waste energy. Examples, I'll show you an example of this. Here's an athlete who is doing a workout, and all I told the athlete to do was every few minutes spin up to a high RPM and hold it for a few seconds, and then allow your cadence to come back down and pedal at a normal cadence. And so you can see that line across the top there is indicating 103 RPM, which wound up being the average for this rider's cadence for the day. And you can see there's spikes here where the athlete's doing high RPMs and low RPMs. And so the athlete is simply just playing with it. It's called fartlek. The athlete is just playing with cadence, going out and just having a good time, just playing around and seeing what it feels like to spin at 120 RPM, then bring it back down to 80 and then go back up. They're always working on good pedaling technique while they're doing that. And I didn't care what the power was. You can see the power here is quite low. The power is like 124 watts. I didn't care what the power was. All I wanted to see was a high cadence when they got it, and lots of times when they brought the cadence up quite high. Okay, I'm only going to take you through one more point here because I'll show you in a little bit that not all these points are going to be necessary for you. I mentioned that there was the base period of training, which I just showed you. That's what you do in the base period. This is the build period of training. And in the build period, we're starting to do things which are based on what? Higher intensity training. We're now working at the intensity of the event we're training for. And so in this case now, these are called the advanced abilities. And you can see there are 3 of them. They're now the sides of the triangle, Dr. Bompa's triangle. Muscular endurance, anaerobic endurance, and power are the 3 sides. And these become the focus then of the build period. So let's start with muscular endurance. Muscular endurance is the most important element for the triathlete who wants to perform at a high level. Once you've established your base fitness, endurance, force, and speed skills, your next most important element of training is muscular endurance. And this is really the key for Ironman, half Ironman, all triathlon racing. This is the key. What it is long intervals with short recoveries, or long, steady efforts. Primary benefit is anaerobic threshold. Benefit is mostly taking place in the muscle. The intensity is moderately high, moderately hard. So on a 10 scale, it's like 6, 7, or 8 if you're just using perceived exertion. If you're using a heart rate monitor, it's like, using my system, it's like 3 to 5A zone, which is just below to just slightly above lactate threshold heart rate. If you're using a power meter, it's like 80 to 102% of functional threshold power. Most people will skip on by that. If you, again, don't understand any of that, it's just a hard effort. Just go out and train at a hard effort. Not real hard, but hard. An example of things called cruise intervals, something like 5 times 6 minutes on with 90 seconds off. That'd be an example of muscular endurance. So go for 6 minutes at a heart rate of, say, zone 4, which is just below threshold. Recover for 90 seconds and do it again. Here's an example of one of those workouts from the build period. Here's a real athlete doing a real workout. There's heart rate, there's power. This is a workout with 2 parts. When you get to the build period, you typically start combining more things into the workouts. You start doing many elements put into one session. And so here what we have in part 1 is the athlete is working on muscular endurance. So for 60 minutes, this athlete was riding in zone 3. This was an Ironman distance athlete, by the way, early in the build period. And went out for a 2-hour workout, actually 3-hour workout. And the first 2 hours, the first hour rather, was being done in the 3 zone, just a moderately hard effort for 1 hour, 3 zone, just holding that very steadily. Then the athlete took a little break there. You can see this gap in the middle. That meant the athlete stopped to use a porta-john or to get some Gatorade or something to take a break. And finally came back and finished off the workout. And it should say 120 minutes. It says 60 minutes. But the athlete wrote 120 minutes at zone 2, which is endurance type workout you recall from the previous slides. So that's an example of the muscular endurance workout, and there'd be many different ways of doing that. We could have done intervals, which I would also have half Ironman and Ironman athletes do in the 3 zone, very long intervals, like 20-minute intervals in this case in the 3 zone, 20 minutes on, 5 minutes off. We would do a whole bunch of those, maybe a couple of hours of intervals like that for the long distance athlete. Okay, now, I'm not going to take you through these next two because you'll see there's big question marks here, and the question marks really mean, is this really something you ought to be doing? And for most triathletes, you really don't need to be working on anaerobic endurance. This is a really high intensity workout, which is really more appropriate for shorter distance racing, Olympic distance, sprint distance, and for elite athletes. These are very high intensity intervals, which are challenging and also at a high risk for injury and eventually over time breaking down mentally just because it's so difficult to do these. So I'm not even going to talk about this right now because for most people this should not be a focus. So I'm going to skip through all the slides on this since I'm running out of time and show you the next one, which also has a question mark. It's called power, and this is something that triathletes don't need to worry about at all. If you're a road cyclist, this would be very important. This is things like sprints, like an 8-second sprint. You know, how often does your race come down to the last 8 seconds? That's almost never. But some road cyclists have to use this a lot because races do often come down to the last 8 seconds in a road race. Triathlon, no. So again, triathletes don't need to worry about this. I'm going to skip through this one. And thank you for having come out. But before you say anything, let me throw in one last thought here. Because you attended, and I appreciate your coming out this morning, if you want a free training plan, I've got several training plans I've created that are posted online. If you'd like a free training plan, they retail for about 70 pounds a piece. We'll give you one for free. Go to our booth downstairs. We'll have a sprint training plan, Olympic and half Ironman training plans, 12-week training plans that normally sell for $100 US. And you can pick one. You can sign up to get a free one. Somebody will send you the link or how to get it in the mail this coming week. But you got to go down to the Training Bible booth, which is down at the bottom of the stairs and on this wall over here, and they'll set you up with it. So with that, I'll stop. If you really want to talk about anything, catch me afterwards. I'll be happy to answer your questions. Thank you for coming out.